Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to WFAA Plus. I'm Chris Lawrence with Michelle Montaine, and we're here, well, because of what's right behind me. Nico Speaks. This is really the first time we have really heard extensively from Mavs GM Nico Harrison since that blockbuster Luka Doncic trade.
Yep.
Michelle, it wasn't a typical interview like we're used to getting. Michelle, walk me through what the Mavs laid out and what you just did.
Yeah, Chris, I'll try to just paint the picture to start because, as you said, this was kind of atypical. I mean, usually when we're going to hear from really anyone associated with a professional sports team, it's done in a very typical way, right?
There's a press room. We set up.
There's a press conference room. TV outlets are allowed to bring their cameras, their microphones. You're set to record the conversation that takes place and then kind of do as you wish within parameters once it's concluded. This was a little bit different in the fact that the Mavs invited a select number of people to listen to both the CEO and the general manager of the Mavericks in a roundtable discussion. They asked that cameras weren't included, recordings. We were allowed to record a transcription of the conversation, but that audio was not to be shared, from our personal outlets. The Mavericks will be sharing the conversation with us, or as they said, that's what they're going to do. But yeah, there were about 15 media members in attendance. There were obviously
in a room,
yes.
Just a small room, and the media, Nico, anyone else there?
Yes, so it was about 15 media members all sitting around this boardroom table. Nico Harrison was there, obviously. The CEO, Rick Welts, was there. And in addition to that small group, there were a couple cameramen and audio guys, and then obviously the PR staff for the Mavericks. So it was an intimate setting for sure. And I will say, I think that was kind of their goal with this. And what we received informationally from the PR team was that they wanted it to be a little bit more of a intimate, controlled setting.
Okay, all right. And just want to make everybody clear, we did request and ask, hey, can we record this like normal? Can we bring a camera in and do it normal? That request was denied, basically.
They said they had their camera in the room with their microphones, and that was how they wanted to run this particular interview, and that, like I said, the expectation is that they would share that, but this literally concluded not even an hour ago.
Yeah, so she's going off memory here.
Yeah.
And there was a lot to digest. So let's dive in. I think I would know what the first question would be, but how did this start?
Well, it started by Tim McMahon, who is an ESPN pundit who's covered the Mavericks for a long time, all the way back to his days at the D-Men. He just said, look, there is constant noise saying that you should be fired, Nico Harrison. What is your response to that? And why should Patrick Dumont not take the fans up on that suggestion? And I thought it was interesting, Nico's response to that. He said, and again, I'll reference my notes because this is going off of conversation, and I don't want to get anything wrong. And I certainly am not going to put words into Nico's mouth. But his response to that was, the beauty of the fan base here in Dallas is that they're so passionate. And that's been his takeaway from this response, is that it is a really passionate fan base. And he even went as far as to say every trade that he's made hasn't necessarily been regarded as a good trade, and sometimes they have taken time. Now, he re-emphasized this point throughout the entire press conference or conversation, but he said right off the bat, look, our philosophy going forward is that defense wins championships, and this was a trade built on defense. This trade cements us as a defensive team going forward. So does he directly say, hey, no, I shouldn't be fired? No, but should you expect him to say that? Probably not. His response to should you be fired? Should we keep hearing fans say, fire Nico? He took it as a positive and said, look, that just tells me that this is a very passionate fan base. They care about who we're putting out on the floor, and I'm going to use that as just more motivation to put a good team out on the floor.
Did he expound on that, ability or his belief, I guess, that he can win these fans back over?
Yeah, I mean, that was a follow-up question not too far off from that initial question. Really, do you feel like you need to win the fans back, especially based on this reaction? his response to that is something that we've heard him say in previous encounters. History will decide whether or not this trade makes sense. But he did also say that putting the roster of Kyrie, Klay Thompson, AD, he even referenced PJ Washington and Derek Lively, his idea was that putting that roster out there is in fact a championship caliber team. Now, his words were, although fans could have been upset with trading Luka, they wouldn't have been upset with the results. And I think that's where, if we drill down there, what he has stood on is that, yes, trading Luka was something that obviously hurt a lot of fans and has consequently hurt attendance and whatnot. But if the roster that he had envisioned was out on the floor following that trade, meaning Kyrie, Klay, AD, PJ.
Derek Lively.
Yes, all of
Gafford,
them.
Yeah.
If they weren't bitten by the injury bug so drastically after the trade that he felt the results would have kind of lessened some of that vitriol that we saw come out in full force following the trade. But to that point, is that necessarily true? And that was a follow-up question. Do you think that winning and the results of winning, and say it is a championship caliber team, and it even brings you a championship, is that still going to bring fans back to a franchise after they lost a player that they loved so much?
Yeah. And he thinks that they will come back?
And it was interesting, Rick Welts jumped in at one point to say, look, I've been in the NBA for 40 plus years, and in every franchise he's been a part of, he's seen and witnessed these superstar trades where the fan base is outraged because their favorite player got traded. And he used several examples dating back to his time with the Seattle Supersonics and then when he was with Golden State. He said that he's been through this before. Yeah. When a favorite player gets traded, and what has happened on the other side is there's a new player that comes in, like a Steph Curry, and that's who the franchise or the fans wrap their arms around. And so while it seems to be it feels so much like a dagger right now for fans, at least the CEO's perspective was that we recover in time once you have that like almost new face that can help with the winning and the recovery of winning those fans back. Now, we have, the Mavs have AD on the roster right now.
Yeah.
And you're still seeing this backlash and this outrage from the fans. So I think both of them are taking the stance that the trade's aftermath will take time as things play out. But to the point about whether or not winning a championship will kind of calm some of the outrage about in exchange trading Luka, there really is still no good answer for that.
Yeah.
There really isn't.
It's funny, I think a day or two ago, I was listening to the Bill Simmons podcast, and they were laying out the NBA playoffs and the scenarios, and they still kept going back to the Luka trade. And they just cannot let it go. A lot like the fans, people are still talking about the parameters of this deal, and I think they likened it to you write a check out to someone, and you basically just say, okay, you fill in the amount. Is what they sort of compared this trade to. Did anyone ask about the return? Okay, you've decided to trade Luka. They've made this decision on this defensive-minded team. Why didn't they ask for Austin Reeves? Why didn't they ask for the Lakers' other first-round draft pick?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, that was asked in kind of two different ways. So the first way was, do you feel like you maximized the return given what you gave up and who you got back? And this answer I found to be very interesting. He said, look, we targeted AD. That was the player. He has made it very clear. That is the player that they were after, bar none. We targeted AD with the philosophy, again, that defense wins championships. I think I heard defense wins championships no less than 50 times this morning. But he said we wanted a two-way player to lead our group. He did acknowledge, like, everyone's going to have their criticisms. I know he's heard a lot of them. But he said verbatim, we got what we wanted out of this trade. So whether or not he takes into consideration all of the criticism that he's gotten since 11:12 p.m. on February 1st or not, his stance is that they got what they wanted out of the trade. Now, as for your second piece of that question, he said, I'm going to check here.
Yeah, feel free, because I think the second piece was about the return in terms of why didn't they just say, okay, give us Austin Reeves, give us that other first round draft pick too, and we'll do the deal.
Yes, no, thank you for the reminder there. The question originally asked to answer that was, and I provided first some additional context here, what was the benefit in keeping everything secret? Like, yes, AD is undoubtedly one of the best players in the NBA. He was on the NBA All-75 team. That is undisputed, yes. But given his age,
injury history,
could you have gotten another two-way player that was maybe younger? And even if he's not as established resume-wise, maybe he has more potential future-wise. Well, this is what I found to be very interesting. Nico's response to that was, we looked at the league, again, targeted AD, and then he pointed out this fact, which is true. He said players dictate where they go in today's NBA, and we've seen that time and time again as far as, a player either requesting a trade or definitely having the leverage when it comes to getting what they want.
These are the teams I would re-sign with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He said that, and this is where I was utterly surprised. He said, you can't shop your best player. That's not responsible. He said the trade might not work. And I think in his perspective, what he's saying there is that if you shop this player around and then he ultimately isn't traded because business negotiations don't work out, and then you have a player who's on your roster who is unhappy to be there, who knows that you wanted to trade him, and then there's this rift in, well, you wanted to trade me, I didn't want to be traded, and now look where we are. So his purview was that, it wouldn't be responsible of him to openly shop this player. I see your face and your reaction because that is what a lot of people immediately following the trade were saying. Like, look, if you're going to trade one of the best players, not just in the country, but in the world, you got to get as much as you can for it. And Nico's taking a different stance and saying it wouldn't have been responsible for me to shop him as a player. He also did bring up the fact that Luka was eligible for the Supermax contract extension this summer. And for those of you that may or may not be familiar with the Supermax, there are basically certain criteria that you have to meet in order to be Supermax eligible. One of which is you still have to be playing for the team that drafted you. Yep. You have to put in a set number of service time or a set number of service years. And if you meet these different criteria, you're eligible.
Make a all NBA team, certain number of years, I think.
There are, a couple bullet points on there, but it basically allows you to get a higher threshold when it comes to your contract extension max versus other players who don't fit that criteria. Obviously, Luka, still playing for the team that drafted him, was eligible for that extension this summer. Nico stood on the fact that he was like that we cannot be certain that Luka was going to sign that contract, even though during Luka's opening press conference in Los Angeles, he stated, yes, I was very much planning to, or it wasn't even a yes, it was the question was, did you consider not signing this? And he said no. Yeah. Like I never considered
And just a caveat, no NBA player has turned down a Supermax. It's the equivalent of saying, no, I don't want that $100 million extra. I'll take $100 million less. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't, even if they try to force their way out later, everybody signs the Supermax when they can sign the Supermax.
Yeah. That's helpful context for sure. And the fact that he look, we don't know what would have happened come June, July, August this summer. Nico is standing on the fact that we don't know that Luka would or wouldn't have signed that contract. But nevertheless, I think his stance on saying it wouldn't have been responsible for me to shop this player was an interesting, different perspective than I think a lot of people had following the trade immediately.
Yeah. I wonder if anyone asked, because I do understand his point in terms of certain players may be hard to trade once that trade request becomes public. I mean, you saw Miami had a difficult time finding a deal for Jimmy Butler, but Jimmy Butler's can be a relatively difficult player who's caused some issues in locker rooms. Jimmy Butler's in his mid-30s, so you could see why teams would go, do I feel comfortable giving Jimmy Butler $50 million out to re-sign him for the next few years? But none of those would be impediments to Luka Doncic.
Right.
I mean, I just would think, did anyone bring up the fact that, since this trade happened, just about every GM in the league has said they would have, basically emptied the coffers to get somebody like that.
Yeah, that point was brought up. Like I said before, a number of times, Nico went back to just stating the fact that he feels like the roster that he constructed via the trade, bringing in Anthony Davis, he even mentioned the potential of Max Christie as he kind of grows throughout his time in the league, that is a championship caliber roster and that would bring championships to Dallas, and that is what he's standing on. So, even if you asked him the question of, other GMs would have given you X, Y, and Z, he made it clear he wasn't interested in that. He was interested in Anthony Davis. They targeted AD. He said that on a number of occasions. So that was priority number one for him. He made that very clear. Now, he was questioned rather adamantly in the meeting, like, explain this logic because people are not understanding. And Nico's response to that was, look, you might not agree with my logic. You might criticize, you might think this isn't the right move, but I do. And that's why these moves were made. People even asked him about Quentin Grimes, the Quentin Grimes trade, because we hadn't had a chance to ask him about that. And he said, look, we wanted Caleb Martin. And if you don't think Caleb Martin is a good player, then you're not going to agree with the trade. But I think Caleb Martin is a good player. I think he fits in with what we want. We wanted to give Quentin more opportunities to be an offensive power, and that's what he's done in Philadelphia. But here, we needed Caleb Martin because he gives us versatility and he gives us that defensive presence that helps them, again, win championships. I think the underlying message here is that he's making these moves based on what he thinks is best, which is underlined by his philosophy that defense is it. Defense wins championships. And he also stands on the fact that if he had the players on the roster that he initially envisioned being out there, when all was said and done, that the results would have been different. The reality is they were severely injured throughout this last couple months of the season, and he didn't have that team out there. And he openly admitted, he said, I think all of that added to the vitriol. And he said even the people who might not have had an opinion were being negative on us because of the results here during the last stretch of the season. There's a lot of what ifs, I think in a way, the fact that they were so injury ridden almost gives you, well, we can't be certain that your team would or wouldn't have worked. Now, Of course, he doesn't wish the injuries took place, but the fact that they did, is that an excuse for, if things worked or didn't work out? So, I think just going back to that point about, what other GMs would have done, he's not worried about that. Okay. And he's not, and if he is, he's certainly not publicly saying it.
Okay, he's doubling down. He's set in his ways.
And
Real quick, I just want to reset as well. If you're just joining us here on the stream on WFAA Plus, I'm Chris Lawrence. I'm here with our sports reporter, Michelle Montaine. And the reason we're talking about this interview like this is because it was a very unusual setup. The Mavs reached out and invited a small group of journalists to come and sit in a round table and hear directly from Nico Harrison for the first time since that Luka Doncic trade. And Michelle, you were one of that small group that was brought into this round table. And just refresh the folks who are just coming into the stream now about the parameters, why we're not showing sound bites from Nico.
Yeah, so as he just laid out, a couple, or I should say several media members from the area were invited to this boardroom setting where we had the opportunity to ask both GM Nico Harrison and CEO Rick Welts questions about not just the trade, but the aftermath and everything that's taken place really since the start of the year. With that being said, they asked us to not bring cameras, to not bring microphones, which typically in a press conference setting or in a normal press conference setting, those are always allowed. Today, they allowed us to record audio individually, but we cannot share that audio that we recorded.
So basically just as a transcript, because
Yes.
trying to remember an hour plus of conversation off the top of your head would be almost impossible.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
So there were about 15 media members. There were a couple guys running audio for the Mavericks. There were some PR people in the room. And then, of course, there was Nico and Rick. And as far as the setting, like we started promptly at 10 o'clock. That was when they asked us to be there. So it was a 10 a.m. start. Each of them gave opening statements that took about 10 minutes. Rick went for about probably 6 or 7, Nico about 3 or 4. And then the remaining it was a 58-minute press conference in total. So the remaining 48 minutes were just the two of them fielding questions from the 15 media members in the room.
Okay. And again, Michelle, you were in there 10, 11. So
10 to 11.
Again, if you're on our stream right now, you're getting her fresh recollections. She literally just got back here to the station
Yes.
after getting out of this. I want to circle back to something as well. Nico Harrison was celebrated.
Yes.
I mean, he was.
Yes.
The cat's meow in North Texas for sort of getting the Mavs over that hump, getting them to the finals, making these deals, and then just like that, I mean, he's persona non grata. I mean, you hear the Fire Nico chants everywhere. Did he talk about it? Did anyone ask him about how he feels personally now when he goes around town?
Yeah, we did. And we also asked him, why continue with all of this vitriol? Like, this is not just got to be hard on you. We know it's got to be hard on his family.
Yeah.
And I'll give him credit. I mean, he said, look, I am a naturally optimistic guy. His takeaway from that question is, look, you see the signs, you hear the chants. Why continue amidst all of this? Right. And he said, look, I'm personally optimistic. I look at our team who at times through the last couple of months have only had 8 players, really 7.5 players available due to minutes restrictions, continue to fight no matter what they're faced with. He doubled down following that question and he said, look, I believe in the trade that I made. That was verbatim. Wow. I believe in the trade that I made. It's going to bring us a championship caliber team going forward. I do believe that once we win, the fans will come back. I got a chance in between driving from the stadium to here to re-listen to some of the sound that I had recorded personally. That was a verbatim sentence. I believe that when we win, once we win, the fans will come back. And, you know, to your question about like all of this noise, how are you doing? He said, I'm solid. My family's solid. I'm personally an optimistic person. And I think he's really standing on that. He talked about leaning on his faith. You got to imagine that this has been a very tumultuous 2.5 months for him as a human being at the core.
Yeah.
And I think fans lose sight of that, certainly because of the decisions that he's made. But he stands on the fact that, you know, the team has kept fighting, regardless of the injuries that they've been faced with or that they've been dealt, and that once they get back to full health, this is a championship caliber team that he has, and he believes in them and believes in them winning.
So I noticed he must have kept going back to that term, championship caliber
I know.
team.
You're probably sick of hearing me say it. I heard it so many times that it's
I
really...
could tell that he really kept going back to that. But just playing devil's advocate, you already had a championship caliber team because you just played for the championship. I mean, that's by definition a championship caliber team. You're in the NBA Finals. You've got a shot to win the championship. I'm wondering, did anyone ask him what changed? Only one team can win it a year. If you make it to the finals, that is an incredible accomplishment. You were right there at the doorstep.
Yeah.
What changed from that last game of the NBA Finals to this trade that made him say, this is unworkable?
You know, I would have to say it was his perception of the defense, because he was asked verbatim, you didn't think that the team that just went to the finals last year could continue to compete? Like, if that's what you're saying, defense wins championships and you were this close to winning a championship, why make a change to the player that led you to said potential championship? And I have it here. I'll say again, defense wins championships. I mean, he continued to hunker down on that perspective. And to your point, I think another thing that he talked about, especially in that initial press conference in Cleveland the day after the trade was announced, he brought up the word culture a couple times. And I think that was something that a lot of people had questions about. So today I got the chance to ask him about that. You know, you said initially that the culture that was here was something that you really wanted to make sure was, you know, formed in this vision that you had.
Okay.
And so, you know, how do you feel like the culture didn't work back then? And then how do you feel like the culture of the team is now post the beginning of February? To his credit, he said, you know, I probably misspoke when I used the word culture. And instead of the word culture, he wanted to replace it with the word philosophy. And $20 to whether or not you can guess what the philosophy is.
Defense wins championships.
$20 to Chris Lawrence here.
I'm saying that in my sleep tonight now.
You and me both.
Because I think a lot of people took culture as a real attack on Luka Doncic, the person, the professionalism, the work ethic, the effort level. That's what culture means, you know, to me, to a lot of folks.
100%. I think his use of the word culture at that time insinuated more than, I guess, today what he's clarifying.
Okay.
And I think that's why he decided to change from culture instead to use the word philosophy. Okay. And he expounded upon that with the fact that his philosophy is defensively based, and that was what triggered the decision to move forward with this trade. As far as how he described the culture today, he said, look, we have a team full of players who, even when they are several men short, continue to fight. No matter what the score is, they continue to play hard. And he feels like that's the culture that's in the locker room right now. It certainly has been the case. Like, this is a team that hasn't given up, and they have been against all odds and even more throughout the last 2.5 months. But as far as that piece of this story, especially when it came out in Cleveland, and then all of the speculation that swirled when he used that word culture and what it must have insinuated because of the trade that, you know, came before it, his clarification today was telling, I thought.
Yeah. So he sort of backed off on the culture argument, because to me the culture argument puts it at the feet of the employees or your team, your players. Philosophy more puts it on management's plate, the executive's plate, to set a philosophy.
Yes. Yeah. You know, I also found it interesting that he was asked, you know, knowing everything you know now, would you have done the trade the same way.
The exact deal. Yeah.
Like, is there anything you would have changed? And he said, again, this one is verbatim. He said, yes, there's no regrets on the trade. That to me was really a powerful moment. You know, this was the third question asked. This is like right out of the gates. The trade itself, all of the anger and all of the backlash that has come from it, would you have done the same thing, or would you have changed anything? He said he would do the same thing. There are no regrets on the trade. He went on to say that I have to do the best thing for the Mavericks today and for the future. Some decisions I make are going to be unpopular, and I have to stand by them. And he has stood by this decision to trade Luka Doncic, despite all of the visceral reaction that has succumbed upon him since the decision that he made. Now, he did say that every trade that he's made while being here has been met with high scrutiny. That includes when he first brought Kyrie here.
Yeah.
There was a lot of questions around that. He said that, you know, when they drafted Derek Lively and even brought in Gaff, like, people were questioning him at the time, and that the only way to find out whether or not those trades were worth it was through time and seeing what the results were once they had time to integrate themselves within the system. So he did say some of these trades will work out. Some of them have at a high level. He's not wrong. And to your point, months ago, we were lauding him as one of the best GMs in the NBA, certainly a beloved GM here in DFW. And now it's crazy how fast things can flip. But that was his direct line was, you know, there are no regrets on this trade. And for him to say that after what we have seen firsthand from the uproar in this fan base over 2.5 months, you know, you take what you will from that.
Yeah.
You know?
Did anyone ask him specifically about dealing with the Lakers? Did anyone ask him about, you know, was there any point at which the Lakers were ready to walk away from the deal if a certain player was included or wasn't included?
The details of the deal with the Lakers honestly weren't really discussed. He was asked if he has spoken to Luka Doncic since the trade. The answer was no.
Okay.
Has not talked to Luka.
Okay. Has he talked to Rob Pelinka?
You know, he didn't answer that either.
Yeah.
I will say I did find it very interesting. When we were at the arena on April 9th, this isn't necessarily about the discussion that took place this morning, but I did see Rob Pelinka go up to Max Christie, you know, dap him up. They were chatting, laughing, smiling on the court following Max Christie's warm-ups. I didn't see, I mean, AD comes to warm up way later. Yeah. I didn't see whether or not Rob Pelinka and AD communicated at all on the floor, but it was really interesting to see the dynamic of Pelinka was out there during warm-ups. He was sitting on the bench. He was talking with coaches. He was talking with people. He was all over the floor.
Yeah.
Nico walked out, did one line down and kind of around the court, and then watched the rest of the game in the tunnel. So definitely a difference there.
Different dynamic.
Yes, a different dynamic. But another thing that was asked during today's conversation about that April 9th game was, how did you feel watching that tribute video to Luka? Because I know
you told me you teared up. She got emotional.
Let me preface with, there were full-grown men around me who teared up. There are people who have covered the NBA for decades.
It was allergies.
Yeah, it was allergies. Who were tears streaming down their face. I don't have a connection to Luka or this franchise the way, like, I'm from San Antonio. I grew up watching the Spurs.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not emotionally invested in the Mavs in the same way. And the tribute and watching Luka so emotional, it was more of just like a humanity moment than like a Mavs Luka moment.
Right. You get out of your sports reporter mode and you're just a human being watching this. Yeah. And
I'm surrounded by all of these people who are having the same reaction. Like, it was just one of those incredible moments in all of sports. And so I asked Nico about how he felt during that moment. You know, he said, I thought the tribute video was very well done. He said, I think the Mavs did a great job at recognizing a player that meant so much to the franchise. And he basically just applauded the Mavericks staffers who made the moment come to life. I also asked the same question to the CEO, Rick Welts, and Rick gave a very genuine answer. He said, look, that was a highly emotional moment. He meant so much to this franchise, and in a way, I was really glad that we were able to say thank you for everything that he had done. And it was interesting just seeing the kind of difference in response. Obviously, they are in two very different worlds when it comes to the decision for the trade and dealing with the aftermath of it. But, it was funny because following asking both of them how they felt having Luka return to the building and seeing how he was celebrated and seeing how emotional everyone in the arena was when that moment came, I then asked Nico, okay, so what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding from fans about why this trade happened? Again, just trying to get at the basis of why.
Yeah.
And
because that's what everybody's still asking to this day. Yeah.
Yes. His answer was, I think the biggest misunderstanding from fans is that defense wins championships. And
okay.
If that is the biggest misunderstanding, then that's what we have to go off of.
Yeah. That's the hill he's going to die on.
It is.
Yeah.
And he mentioned a couple of times, he was like, you guys got to see it for 2.5 quarters. And during those 2.5 quarters, they were a dominant defensive team.
Yeah.
But I guess you just can't really count out the fact that this is an injury-prone group that you're talking about too.
Yeah.
To his point, though, he said a lot of these injuries this year were contact injuries. Those are unavoidable. There was no way for him to predict that those injuries would have happened, and that is an objective statement. There's no judging that, yes or no.
Did he talk about it all? Because he dealt for Kyrie, who had an injury history. Mm-hmm. He dealt for AD, who had an extensive injury history. Did he ever have injury concerns about Luka before he made this deal?
I don't think that. So he wasn't asked directly about injury history of Luka. He was asked about basically kind of the fact that he broke the players down into 3 categories. And this was actually at the beginning of his opening statement. He said, look, I feel like the way that our roster is constructed, we basically have guys in 3 different buckets. It's a balanced roster. That's what he kept talking about. He put together a balanced roster, and it's led by championship veterans. That includes Kyrie, AD, and Clay.
Oh, Clay too.
All of them have a ring to their name.
Yep.
There's guys in their prime. He talked about Daniel Gafford, or really entering their prime, you should say, that are in that kind of 25 to 30 age range, or 26 to 30 age range. Gaff, some of the other guys like PJ and
Max Christie.
So he actually said Max, and then he kind of backtracked. They have them in their prime, and then there's this group of guys who are younger, kind of up and coming.
Okay.
Yes, and he actually put Max in that bucket. He put Derek Lively in that bucket, Jaden Hardy. He also says, whoever they draft this year will be kind of in that bucket. And so I think in his mind, from the injury perspective, you're almost trading off injury history for championship caliber experience. And at least that's how he broke it down, grouping wise. The guys who have the injuries are in that kind of veteran, lead by example, lead by experience bucket. Now, trading a guy who's 25 and in his prime, he was asked about that as well. He was like, okay, so you talked about these guys in their prime, but Luka would fall into that category. And he said, honestly, I don't have an answer for that. Time will tell whether or not he's in his prime or not, or if that's still to come. But he didn't really touch much on injuries, especially from a Luka angle at all.
Okay.
I did also.
It's just interesting, though, that while yes, they're both championship caliber players, we saw AD play extremely well in the bubble. We saw Kyrie hit that iconic shot against Golden State. But the thing they have in common is they both have a championship playing with LeBron James. A lot of people win championships playing with LeBron James. He's been to 10 NBA Finals. I'm just wondering, does he feel their championship experience can stand separately apart from LeBron?
That's a really good question, but LeBron wasn't mentioned even once this morning. It's a really interesting perspective you provide there, and he was asked about, did you make this decision almost knowing that you had Kyrie to kind of shoulder some of that offensive load? Was that part of why you made this decision? And he said, look, every factor was taken into consideration. Yes, Kyrie was a big part of it, but we looked at every player and the roster as a whole and how it's constructed, and every single piece was taken into consideration when it came to making the trade in the end. But to your point, I think there had to have been some sort of calculation where Kyrie takes over some of what Luka was generating, especially on offense. And he gives that up for the two-way player that you're getting in Anthony Davis.
Okay. So as we kind of wind down the conversation again, just want to bring you up to speed. Michelle was invited to a small round table of sports journalists, sitting down with Nico Harrison for the first time since that Luka Doncic trade. Anything else that you sort of took away from what he said, how he said it, that gives us a little insight into his mind, both at the moment of pulling the trigger on that deal and now today in hindsight? Well,
it was interesting that it took place today. And somebody did ask, why wait 2.5 months to talk to us? Like, you say you don't regret the trade, but would you do anything differently on how you handled it since then? And I found that part to be a little bit insightful. He said, yes, we're always learning on the how. Rick and him have talked about how they could have done things differently, how we responded. To close out that answer, he said, look, I did address the media, which he did in Cleveland the day after. He said that he was hoping that a lot of the vitriol would have subsided, but that didn't happen due to a lot of the injuries. And there's no telling. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. Like, it's almost like the injuries are an excuse in a way. There's no telling as to what could have happened had the roster that he envisioned been out on the floor night in and night out following the trade. I will say, being in the American Airlines Center on that February 10th game, I think, whenever AD made his debut with the Mavs, when they were beating the Houston Rockets, it was an excited atmosphere. People were enjoying what was happening in the game. So if we saw that every night from the time the trade happened, would this be a different instance? Would this be a different situation? There's obviously no telling, but I think there were a couple hills that he's going to stand on, and those were made apparent during the conversation. We've touched on a lot of them. I think the biggest takeaways are that he has no regrets on making this trade, despite all of the backlash, all of the anger that has been directed to him, to his face, and to his surroundings. He still doesn't regret it. He stands by it. He feels like, say it with me, defense wins championships. And those were the hills that he was going to die on.
Yeah. And just, does he have any regrets? Because as an outsider, there felt like a dichotomy between this incredible tribute video to Luka Doncic and letting him know what he meant to North Texas and the team and the fans, and all of the stuff that was leaking out in the wake of this trade about his work ethic and his off-season habits and his conditioning and like that. Did he have any regrets about sort of tarnishing Luka's name on the way out the door?
That's a really interesting question. We didn't get the chance to ask him that. For the most part, it was just him trying to not go there. His one comment about kind of changing culture to philosophy was as far as he went in terms of talking about like anything that could have shed a bad light on Luka, but he really didn't touch on any of that specific piece. I will say he was asked about kind of the culture that he was walking into. I mean, the Mavericks franchise is a culture built on loyalty, and Dirk Nowitzki is as big a part of this franchise as anyone ever. And he did acknowledge that, but he said, you know, I wasn't sure what the culture was before I came here. Like, I wasn't sure what the Mavs philosophy was before coming here. He did say Luka's an amazing player. He had a good run, but defense is going to be our calling card. I know, try not to have nightmares about the word defense. And when he was, there was a follow-up question asked, don't you think it's important that you know what the culture is that you're walking into? And Nico said, look, I worked for a lot of companies in my life, and before you get there and before you're in it, there's no way to really know what the culture is. I think from an outside perspective, Dirk kind of set the foundation for that culture. Mm-hmm. He was asked several times, like, why didn't you include Dirk in any conversations about trading Luka? This is a guy whose perspective and opinion on this franchise means so much. And he was like, I can't be consulting with people who aren't in the building every day. He didn't take Dirk into consideration when making this trade. And I think that goes without saying.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, but no, as far as the people whose names are so associated with the franchise, they were not taken into account when it came to making this decision. That includes Mark Cuban, that includes Dirk Nowitzki, that includes anyone else that maybe previously had a big role with the franchise who doesn't currently. It was a very under the radar deal, which we know, but he reemphasized that today.
Yeah. My 11-year-old son's name is Nicolas. It goes by Nico. Mm-hmm. Everybody calls him Nico, and he's been just having a devil of a time the last couple months because his friends are like, "Oh, fire Nico, fire Nico," and you just hear it everywhere. I mean, sporting events that don't have anything to do with basketball, people will just start chanting. Did he address it all? Has he ever spoken to his bosses about everybody wants me fired? Is this the place for me? So to address the Fire Nico chants specifically, his response to the Fire Nico chants is, look, I'm taking this as a positive that the Dallas fan base and the Mavericks fan base is so passionate. And eventually, if we can start giving them wins, that passion focused on firing me will transition to passion loving the Mavericks. And that was right out of the gates. Like, his response to all the Fire Nico chants was that I'm taking this as a sign that the Dallas fan base is very passionate, and that will ultimately be a good thing once we can start winning. However, he was asked about his contract window. He said, he was more so asked about his future with the Dallas Mavericks long term. Does he think that he's going to be here long term? His response to that was, I have 3 years left on my contract. My plan is to finish that out. Right now, Dallas is our home. My kids are expected to finish out school here. I'm going to finish out my contract. Now, there was no discussion about anything beyond that, but that was his response as to, how he's viewing his future here with the Mavs. Okay, all right. And his contract sort of aligns with
that
Kyrie
window. Yes.
Extension, Anthony Davis, and all that as well. All right. Well, just to wrap things up, kudos to you, Michelle. I mean, it's not. This is, like we said, it's unusual the way this was set up. The Mavs invited the small group of journalists, including Michelle, to sit down. It's not easy to synthesize an hour of conversation the way you just did. But again, we got some insight on Nico Harrison's mindset, both leading up to the trade and how he's feeling now. So hope you enjoyed the stream, and look for more coverage from Michelle tonight on our newscast.